everybody. It's Tuesday, January the 7th, 2025. A year and 3 days ago, back on the 3rd of January 2024, we did one of my favorite interviews with my favorite writer on the Mafia, Louis Ferrante. His first volume in his 3-volume history of the American Mafia was out. Very interesting book. Borgata, Rise of Empire, 19th and first part of the 20th century history of the Mafia. And Louis Ferrante is back with the second volume. A year later, Borgata, Clash of Titans, and the great Louis Ferrante is joining us from Sarasota in Florida. Louis, congratulations on this second volume.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Andrew, and it's nice to be with you.
So, Louis, this focuses on 20 years from 1960 to the mid-80s. The first volume was, what, 100 years or certainly 70 or 80 years?
That's right. The first volume was 100, but the material that was available for me, to me through research was probably in 100 years a lot less than the material available to me in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, the press and more of a law enforcement focus on the Mafia. So there's a lot more things that we know. So you could fill a book for 100 years for the first volume, whereas 20 in the second was nothing.
Yeah, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, Louis, and you wouldn't, I'm sure, let me. But I'm guessing that this was a period of 25 years of critical importance to the history of the Mafia. It doesn't mean that the previous period wasn't important, but you had a series of remarkable events packed into this 20 years. Is that fair?
That is correct. And as you said, the first 100 years was the rise of the Mafia. And the next 20 years is a crucial time period for their survival. And that's why it's called Clash of Titans. Some of the most powerful men in America are at odds. The empire has been built, if I may call it that. Time magazine and Life magazine have referred to it as an empire in the past, the Mafia empire. So I do so as the same. And it's a time when the Kennedys rise. Specifically, John Kennedy becomes president of the United States and appoints his brother Robert F. Kennedy attorney general. And that is the real, that's the meat of the book, the Kennedy assassination, how it came about, why it came about. And there are a lot of moving parts, and I try to include it all. The Mafia was part of the conspiracy, probably a driving force in the conspiracy, but they couldn't have done it without their co-conspirators. And I lay out the co-conspirators, who they are in the book. And it sort of was like a perfect storm that began to brew in Louisiana. And that's where the whole thing was planned.
Yeah, it's interesting. Louis, you talk about the assassination. Of course, there were 2 assassinations of JFK and RFK. So let's begin in 1960 with, of course, JFK is coming to power. How central in JFK's mind was the Mafia with American history? Was it just an obscure footnote, or did he, by 1960, was he increasingly recognizing that the Mafia was an important reality, a reality that he needed to, if not eradicate, certainly confront in 1960?
It's an excellent question, because my research, and it's over 10 years of research involved in this, and I mean dogged research, 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. John F. Kennedy was more of a lighthearted, easygoing guy. He was dragged into politics by his father, Joseph Kennedy, who had a relationship with many mobsters. And this testimony not only comes from mobsters to that extent, but also to members of the Kennedy clan, the Kennedy family, also testified that Joe Sr. had a relationship with mobsters in the area of bootlegging during Prohibition. Post-Prohibition, his liquor distribution company needed the Mafia's help in controlling the distribution throughout the United States. And also, too, he had like a B movie industry, movie company in Hollywood. And he needed also the mob to make sure that he had no labor problems, no labor troubles. So he was well acquainted with the mob. as far as the two Kennedy brothers was concerned, I make a very, very pressing argument that Bobby Kennedy was the one who had it in for the Mafia, not necessarily John Kennedy. And it all began with the Rackets Committee, more formally known as the McClellan Committee, where Bobby chose to go after the Teamsters and all of the racketeers involved with the Teamsters. Originally, Teamsters were headed by Dave Beck, who Bobby took down. And then Beck was replaced by Jimmy Hoffa, who became Bobby's personal nemesis. And at that time, Bobby dragged John into the committee. He wanted John as a Democratic senator on the committee, and he desperately, desperately wanted him there and fought with him to get him on that committee. John was more like, hey, you know what? You go after the mob and labor. I'll play a backseat in that. And Bobby kept saying, no, you need to be involved in this. And why Bobby wanted them both, their faces both on Front Street, is because he wanted them to become known to the American public, because the Rackets Committee hearings were televised and they were covered by the press extensively. And Bobby knew that the Kennedy name would become a household name if they went after the mob. And at some point or another, Bobby pissed off a lot of mobsters during the Rackets Committee. He had no great, how should I say, he violated their civil rights in many ways, and he didn't care. And when his brother was running for president, when he declared his candidacy for president of the United States, Joe Kennedy not only reached out to his own contacts in the mob, but he asked Frank Sinatra, who was very friendly with mob bosses throughout the country, if he could liaison for him and get them to help out in places where they needed help with the mob. Now, the mob controlled, for example, in Illinois, where the election was very close when John F. Kennedy did beat Richard Nixon. It was one of the narrowest margins in history. Well, the mob pulled that out for him. They not only had Mayor Daley, who was very close with the Kennedys and very close with the mob who put him in office, but they also had Sam Giancana, who was the boss of the Chicago mob, and he controlled a number of the wards where he could make sure that they turned out for Kennedy. And there were a number of ways in which he did that. Also, leading up to the general election, there was the crucial West Virginia primary when Kennedy really desperately needed to win the Democratic primary against Hubert Humphreys. And the mob dumped money into the West Virginia primary, tons of cash. And then there was an overwhelming amount of evidence that the mob did dump money into the West Virginia primary, overwhelming amount of evidence that they did help in crucial places like Chicago, where Kennedy needed to swing the state of Illinois. And the reason why they helped after Bobby went after them in the Rackets Committee is because they were promised that the Kennedys would move on to more national issues like civil rights for African Americans, which was a big subject at the time, like the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, trying to get that under control with the Soviets. So the mob figured, hey, they used this as a stepping stone to get a household name. Senator S.T. Schifalva had done that with us in the past. Governor Thomas Dewey, as a prosecutor, had done that with us in the past. We assume the Kennedys will be doing the same thing with us, and we should be okay to get them in office because they'll move on to bigger things and forget us. And that's what they were promised. But when John F. Kennedy got in and then appointed Robert F. Kennedy as his attorney general, and what's interesting, because a lot of people did not know this, the reason why Joe Kennedy Sr. wanted Bobby to be appointed attorney general, wanted John to appoint him, is because of all the election questions. Was the election stolen? Did the mob help? These were people were asking these questions, and he figured if Bobby's attorney general, this stuff won't go anywhere, and it didn't. But the next thing,
it's a very interesting interpretation. Of course, before Bobby Kennedy was involved with the Rackets Committee, he worked for a while with Joe McCarthy, the principal red baiter, perhaps the most radical anti-communist figure in American post-war history. Do you think that the fervor that Bobby Kennedy brought to battling the Mafia, and particularly Jimmy Hoffa, was in some ways similar to the kind of fervor, the moral fervor that Joe McCarthy brought to anti-communism in America? Yes.
Excellent comparison. 110% yes. Actually, when Bobby worked for McCarthy, Joe Kennedy made a statement to a friend of his, and he said, Bobby would have been an excellent Nazi if he lived in Germany, and he would have been very sincere about it. He said he would have been excellent at it, and he would have been very sincere about it. And he had those Gestapo tactics that he used always. It was in him. And when he became Attorney General, he picked up the feud that he left off in the Rackets Committee, and he immediately started going after the mob across America. And he pushed them up against the wall where they felt their survival was on the line. They felt it was do or die for either them or him. And at some point or another, the question was, do we whack Bobby? And at some point or another, they molded over and they came up with the conclusion that by whacking John Kennedy, that was the best way to destroy Bobby. Because as
wow, well, I want to get to the whacking because that's an interesting and still pertinent subject. My understanding, Louis, and you've done a lot more reading and thinking about this, is that RFK was profoundly offended by Jimmy Hoffa. When they first met, it was a famous dinner meeting in the late 50s, and they took an instant dislike to one another, perhaps because in a way, they weren't that different, except that Kennedy was from the aristocracy and Hoffa was from the American working class, or almost the sub-working class. Did these guys in an odd way have a lot in common? Were they similar personality types?
They weren't similar. They were identical. Their characters were identical. And most people don't know that, what you just pointed out. They had the same things that moved one man, moved the other. And they had a distaste and hatred, which grew into a hatred for each other because what you just said. Bobby felt that, I think Bobby was jealous of Hoffa because he pulled himself up by his own bootstrings and he came from nothing. And I think that Hoffa was jealous of Bobby because he was a millionaire as a youngster. His father had already built a trust for all of his children. And then he got X amount when he turned 18 and another X amount when he turned this age and that age. It's all in the book. And Hoffa despised them for that. So although their characters and personalities were identical, just as you said, they came from opposite sides of the spectrum in society's social ladder and financial ladder. And because of that, that's what they used to hate each other. And the more that Hoffa defied Bobby, the more Bobby hated Hoffa. The more Bobby came after Hoffa and singled him out, the more Hoffa hated Bobby. And the feud just wouldn't go away. So that when the mob did acquiesce to Sinatra's request to back the Kennedys, Hoffa was one of the dissenters. He says, I will never back them. Those SOBs, what they've done to me, those Kennedy brothers, specifically Bobby, I will never back them. And he found partners in two Gulf Coast bosses, Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, one from Florida, the other from Louisiana. They went against also they refused to go along with the New York and Chicago bosses and the Los Angeles boss. They refused to go along with them and back Kennedy. They said, no, this guy's a problem and he's going to give us a headache once he's in office. First, they backed Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic primary. When Johnson lost to Kennedy and was picked as his vice president, then they backed Richard Nixon for the general election, meaning Hoffa, Trafficante, and Marcello. And those are three of the main conspirators eventually.
It's so interesting, Louis, but explain how organized crime was in 1960. Did Hoffa and Marcello and Trafficante, I mean, we all know, of course, from The Godfather and from many other Hollywood movies that the mafia met and there were these organized meetings of all the families. But was this happening in 1960? Were there moments where Hoffa and Marcello and Trafficante would sit around a table?
Yes, there was indeed. And it was happening. So the mob today is all over the place. And that's will be the third volume, Autumn of Empire. But at this moment in time, the mob is very, very tight control of the rackets, very organized. They're still meeting with each other. They have a nationwide commission. They sit, they discuss things. And they had such a tight control over the U.S. economy. And amidst other rackets, let's just say the Teamsters, there were
unions, of course. We need to remind ourselves that Jimmy Hoffa was supposed to be the head of a union. I mean, he wasn't formally a mafia. He wasn't like Marcello or Trafficante.
No, Hoffa's the head of a union. However, Hoffa was in a precarious position because without the mob support, you cannot become the president of the Teamster Union. And the reason being is the mobsters controlled the locals, the Teamster locals throughout the country. And those Teamster locals and vice presidents vote on the Teamster president. So if you don't have the mafia's support, you can't carry the election. So Hoffa has to make the mobsters happy. But at the same time, Hoffa was a genuine tough guy. He wasn't a rollover. The mob also had problems getting everything they wanted from him, which will be another story that leads to his death, which happens in the book as well. But Hoffa was a genuine tough guy, but he wasn't a mafioso in any way. He was a real labor leader who loved the working man. He was a working man himself. His father was a miner. He drove machinery in the mines and died at a young age. Hoffa believed black lung disease. He believed he died because of the mining. His mother worked several jobs in Detroit after that for car companies. She polished hubcaps. He was a hardworking man, and he came from a hardworking family. So he was a real labor leader in every sense of the way, every sense of the term.
Didn't he meet his wife on the front line of a strike? And
Joe Hoffa.
Yeah.
You know, I thought he was introduced to her by an ex-girlfriend at some point, but she could have been on the front lines with him a number of times. But usually it was too violent. I think he would have kept her away.
So just to briefly go back to the Kennedys and Joe Kennedy in particular, my understanding is that when he wasn't sympathetic to Bobby Kennedy going on the Rackets Committee because he was fearful that it might undermine the working class support for JFK. He was obsessed with JFK's presidential bid, even in the mid-50s. What impact did that have on the white working class vote for Kennedy in 1960? It was, as you noted, it was a very, very close election.
It did have an impact, and Joe Kennedy did see it coming. Joe Kennedy wanted both sons to avoid going after labor. You don't mess with labor. Labor it's a vote you need.
It's understandable, especially from the Democratic point of view.
Absolutely. Well, what happened was, though, prior to Bobby going on the committee, the Teamsters through Dave Beck had they endorsed Eisenhower, who was a Republican, and that infuriated the Democrats. And Bobby said, you know what? If he endorsed Eisenhower, let's expect him to endorse another Republican the next time around. Let's go after them. Let's smear them now so that when they don't endorse us, we could say, well, they're a bunch of criminals. We don't want their endorsement anyway. And that's exactly what happened. After Bobby went after Hoffa and connected him to all these mobsters that he dragged in front of the Rackets Committee, he was able to say, John F. Kennedy was able to say when he was running for president, thank God I don't have Hoffa's endorsement. Who needs a criminal's endorsement? You know, that thank goodness. So it worked out. The Kennedys actually played it well, but Joe Kennedy was extremely fearful of just exactly what you said. Don't alienate labor. Don't alienate the working man. We need to be in the White House. We need to get into the Oval Office. Don't blow it with a huge block of voters. And Bobby and Jack were able to masterfully turn that to their advantage. And it was still a close election, but however, they were able to say when Hoffa endorsed Nixon, well, who cares? They're a bunch of crooks anyway, the Teamsters and that Hoffa. We don't need his endorsement.
I want to come to the JFK assassination in a second, but we noted, or you noted, that RFK, Bobby Kennedy and Hoffa were in some ways very similar personalities. But was there something intrinsic about organized crime or the mafia as an alternative to the state that really offended Bobby Kennedy? Of course, he was a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School. He became Attorney General. He wasn't a law nerd, but he made his career as a lawyer. He was on the Rackets Committee as a lawyer. Was he philosophically offended with this idea of a kind of patrimonialism where the legal U.S. state was shadowed by an unofficial state? Is that what in part drove him, alongside his deep hatred of Jimmy Hoffa? Yes, and it's actually a two-pronged answer. One is, yes, Bobby despised the mob, and he wrote a book following the Rackets Committee called The Enemy Within. And he considered the mafia the enemy within. They're worse than any terrorist. They're worse than any adversary.
any nation. It's the mafia. They're a cancer from within.
And it was a bestseller, wasn't it?
It was. And because he felt that way about the mob, and also, too, by the way, he knew that the mob could grind the U.S. economy to a halt by telling the Teamsters, stop the trucks. If you stop the trucks, the U.S. economy could have been ground to a halt overnight. And he thought that that was too much power in the mafia's hands, that they could control the U.S. economy. And there's nothing that any senator or congressman or woman could do about it if the mob and the Teamsters decided to do that. However, this is what offended the mob. He felt that they were the enemy within, and he went after them with the passion of like as Theodore Roosevelt's daughter said, the passion of a Jesuit monk, sussing out infidels. And that offended the mob because they felt, well, we did business with Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was crooked. The Kennedy money is dirty. So why do you come after us? Why don't you look at your own fortune and see how you got there? Because you're the next generation. Don't forget where you came from. And that's what offended the mob. And there are people within the Justice Department who worked for Bobby. And they said every time that we would be following a lead, whether it be for the Teamsters or for the Mafia, and we would come across somewhere where Joe Kennedy's name popped up, whether it be liquor distribution or he owned buildings that were rented to the Teamsters in New York. Whenever these things popped up and Bobby was confronted with it, they said he would become completely bent out of shape. He would lose his regular, his esteem would just drain right out of him. And he would be finished for the day because he could not face the fact that that fortune that he had made his name on was dirty. And
it's ironic. It's particularly ironic given the fact that in the Mafia, loyalty is everything. And to Bobby Kennedy, loyalty, his family loyalty was everything. So the people he most loathed in his life, like LBJ, were the people who he saw at least as offending his father. So he kind of used this, I don't know what you would call it, the ideology of the family or the loyalty to the family, which wasn't that different from at least the ideal form of Mafia loyalty and trust to go after the Mafia.
It was exact. The Kennedy family was like a Mafia.
Yeah, they're a clan and literally and symbolically.
Exactly. And they were very, very tight. And once again, not from testimony from mobsters, but testimony from within the Kennedy circle, time and time again. Even Gore Vidal, the writer who was related to the Kennedys, John H. Davis was related to the.
Yeah, Vidal hated Bobby Kennedy. They
all hated incident. Bobby, and they all spoke about how the Kennedys were so tight knit that they could be arguing with each other. They could be at each other's throats in the living room, because they were a competitive family. But if a rock went through the window, the whole family went out to kill whoever threw the rock.
It's funny. I don't want to keep on bringing up The Godfather, but can't resist, Louis. There's something about Bobby Kennedy that reminds me of Michael Corleone. You remember that famous moment, I think, in Godfather 2 when he said, I want to get out of this thing, and they keep on dragging me back in.
Except for Bobby. Bobby was the one, I think, who dragged his family deeper and deeper. And I make that argument throughout the book that I think John F. Kennedy was a very laid-back guy. He had an easygoing personality. He was very humorous, and he made mistakes throughout his administration that I point out that also drove the Cuban exile community into the arms of the Mafia, that drove rogue CIA agents who trained the Cuban exiles into the arms of the Mafia.
But this, of course, was a consequence of the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis and the hatred they had, particularly Bobby Kennedy, for Castro.
A raging hatred for Castro. But I think they dropped the ball on both the Bay of Pigs and the Missile Crisis. And I have to side with, not to say I side with the Hawks, but I do side with the members of the administration who urged Kennedy to do something both times. The first time he needed to provide air support for the Bay of Pigs, for the exiles when they were stranded on the beach. The second time, they felt it was an ideal opportunity to invade the island. There were nuclear missiles off the coast of Florida. Get in there. This is our excuse. And both times they felt Kennedy dropped the ball. But Bobby was the
Right,
driving.
they drop the ball, Louis, then drop the bomb. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Of course, Kennedy now. I was in Dallas last month. Kennedy is most remembered as a tragic figure assassinated in Dallas in 1963, in November the 22nd, 1963. There have been many, many books and movies about this assassination and the association of the mafia with it. What's your take? What have you uncovered in Clash of Titans that hasn't been said before?
Well, at the forefront of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and there's overwhelming evidence. I cite all my sources throughout the book. I urge listeners to read the book. Everything is sourced. I don't shoot from the hip. I don't pull theories out of thin air. This is all based on evidence. The conspiracy began in Louisiana. The Mafia's Clausewitz was a man by the name of David Ferry. David Ferry was a contract agent for the CIA. He was also a pilot. He did a lot of things against Castro to try to sabotage. First, he tried to help. He did things for the CIA that helped Castro before Castro took power, because they were splitting the difference between Batista and Castro at the time, not knowing who was going to win. And then when Castro took over and became a Marxist leftist, it bothered Ferry, who was an extreme right-wing extremist. And Ferry hated the Kennedys and hated Castro. And then Ferry, by chance, meets Carlos Marcello in Louisiana, whose life was turned upside down by Robert Kennedy. And Marcello was deported in the most unceremonious way you could imagine. He went to check in with a probation officer, his deportation immigration officer, and just an immigration official, rather, who his deportation was stayed for a long time. When he went to check in one day, these big guys grabbed him and tossed him on a plane and dumped him in Guatemala. And it was an illegal deportation that Bobby knew was illegal. People in the Justice Department urged Bobby not to do it, said it's embarrassing to us because we are breaking the law. It was based on a forged birth certificate that Marcello had gotten from Guatemala that Bobby knew to be forged. And Bobby,
okay, so they pissed off. I take your point, but I mean, I'm not excusing it. Before we get to more of your theory, the one person we haven't mentioned who needs to be included in all of this is J. Edgar Hoover, of course, who ran the FBI, had a very awkward relationship with RFK. RFK used to joke about him as J. Edna Hoover. The men didn't like each other, just as Bobby Kennedy didn't like Lyndon Johnson. My understanding is that Hoover was always obsessed with communism and was also very hostile to African Americans, but less concerned with the organized mob. Is that perhaps because they could compromise him, that he was somehow in their sphere, or was he just disinterested in all this?
I debunked all the myths that claimed that the mob was holding pornographic pictures of him, that the mob had dirt on him that they were holding over his head. I debunked all of those myths in volume 1 and 2 of the Borgata trilogy. And in volume 2 specifically, it comes to light that Hoover knew the mob was embedded in the U.S. political system. They owned congressmen, they owned senators, they owned governors, they owned mayors. They put a lot of people into office. They backed a lot of campaigns. I mean, Hoover felt like, okay, what does Bobby want me to do? Surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everyone to come out with their hands up? I mean, if I trace the mob's money, not only is it going to reveal that it goes all the way to Washington, D.C., but it's also going to take down Joe Sr. Is that really what Bobby wants? It's going to destroy the Kennedy fortune. We'll all know it's dirty money. I mean, that's what a forensic look at the mafia would conclude. And Hoover knew, stay away from it. Hoover was more concerned with internal and external threats to the institutions of the United States government. The mob was never a threat to the institutions of the government.
It was an alternative government, guilty or responsible for all sorts of violence and for.
But they need the democratic capitalist system to live within. So they never wanted to take down and destroy the American dream and ideology and burn the flag. Mobsters love America. They fought for America time and again. They went to war. They came back from war, and they picked it up where they went, in Queens, Brooklyn, with the mob stuff.
Are you suggesting then, Louis, that you approve of the fact that Hoover turned a blind eye, for better or worse, to a lot of what?
I'm not saying I approve of it. I am saying that I understand where his focus.
He was obsessed with anti-communism. He was obsessed with MLK, bugging him up the wazoo.
Correct.
I mean, a lot of people would argue that the threat of MLK or a small group of communists in America was minute compared to the mob.
Not to Hoover. If you do enough research on Hoover.
No, I understand that. I understand that to Hoover, the threat was enormous, but most people, I think, conclude that it wasn't, that it was a figment of his imagination.
Now we know that. We know that Hoover was wrong. We know that, obviously, I don't believe that if you do even a deep dive into MLK, who's one of my greatest heroes, probably not only just one of my greatest American heroes, but world heroes. I think that Hoover not only feared MLK's the charisma he had in the civil rights movement and getting it started and getting it to the height where it was, but I think also too when Martin Luther King started to go against the Vietnam War, that's when you're going against what Hoover felt.
Okay, so no, I apologize. I think it's a bit of a distraction, maybe a subject of another book, Louis. Let's get to the assassination. What's your theory? What really happened in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963? And how was the mob involved?
Okay, so Marcello, leading up to the assassination, there's evidence that Marcello put a huge price tag on Kennedy's head. And people were saying, when Kennedy comes down south, people in the mob were saying this, again, all sourced in my book. When Kennedy comes down south, he's going to buy it. He's going to get killed. Somebody's going to take him out. Marcello's got a big price tag on his head. Marcello then was also in the company of people leading up to the assassination, prior to the assassination, saying, hey, those son of a bitch Kennedys got to go. We got to get rid of them. And then somebody said to him, are you planning to whack Bobby? And he said, what good would that do? If you cut the tail off a dog, the dog will still bite you. You have to cut off the head, and then the head and tail die together. John Kennedy has to go. Then there's another occasion where he said that if Kennedy doesn't go, if Bobby rather is killed, John Kennedy will send out the Marines. You have to take out the president, and Bobby will die automatically. And that was sort of Marcello going into it up to more than a year before Kennedy's killed. Marcello was saying that in the presence of witnesses. Now, leading up to the assassination, a number of mobsters are talking on bugs, saying that Kennedy's going to be killed and Kennedy's got to go and Kennedy must die. These things are going past Hoover's desk, and Hoover ignored them all. Why did Hoover ignore them? Because Bobby put Hoover in his place. Hoover had a direct line to the president for decades before Bobby came around. When Bobby came around as Attorney General, he said, I am your boss. You work for the FBI. You are the head of the FBI, but the FBI falls under the Attorney General. You need to go through me. And Hoover despised him for that. Another thing he did was he set out to prove that Hoover was a homosexual. And this is the assistant FBI director saying this. Bobby and in the Justice Department. Now, today, who cares? You're homosexual. Nobody cares today. But people have to realize it's 1960s America. You could not be smeared as a homosexual.
Okay, so let's get back, Louis, to the assassination. Mm-hmm. Was it an organized hit job?
100%. Now, can I tell you who the shooters were?
Of course you can.
I have no idea. You can't. I don't know exactly who pulled the trigger. I would be lying. I could be like a million other authors who just pull one of the suspects out of thin air and make it the focus of their book. I don't know who the shooters were. Prior to Dallas, I will tell you two instances that happened that reinforced, though, that the shooters it was an organized cabal and they were backed by the mob. This is the biggest part of my book that's new. No one's ever written this. Prior to Dallas, there's an informant. This is out, but follow my theory is what's never been out. There's an informant in Miami who tapes someone saying, when Kennedy comes to Florida, Kennedy had 3 trips planned: Florida, Chicago, and Dallas. 3 places controlled by the mob. Florida was controlled by Santo Trafficante. Chicago was controlled by Sam Giancana, also a co-conspirator. Dallas is a satellite of Marcello's Louisiana empire, controlled completely by Marcello. And I make the argument, and I show you evidence why. And he gave money to Lyndon Johnson's campaigns for decades. Since Lyndon Johnson started out in Texas, he was backing Johnson. So Kennedy has 3 trips planned coming up in November. First, he's coming to Florida. And the informant tapes somebody saying, Kennedy's going to buy it when he comes down here. We got it all planned already. He's going to get it with a high-powered rifle from a building, and we're going to pick up some patsy a few hours after and blame the whole thing on him. This is before Dealey Plaza. This is on tape. The government has the tapes. The transcripts are available. So they stopped Kennedy's. They stopped the assassination from taking place in Florida. They arrest the guy. They drive him out of town, and they protect Kennedy. Kennedy now goes. He's supposed to go to Chicago. Well, there's a tip to the Chicago Secret Service, the satellite office in Chicago, telling the Secret Service there were 4 guys who were going to kill Kennedy on the motorcade route with high-powered rifles, and this guy, Thomas Arthur Valley, is going to be taken into custody. He's going to be the patsy. That same guy got a job in a building overlooking the motorcade route in Dallas. At the same time, Oswald got a job in Dallas. Overlooking the motorcade route in Chicago. At the same time, Oswald got a job in the book depository overlooking the motorcade route in Dallas. So these 2 guys who were very much alike, both ex-Marines, both supposedly a little off mentally, both members of right-wing groups, but connected to Cuban exiles. Both guys get jobs overlooking the motorcade routes, one in Dallas, one in Chicago. He's brought into custody, Thomas Arthur Valley, at the last minute. Kennedy's trip is canceled at the last minute because the leader of Vietnam was accidentally executed, supposedly accidentally because the CIA wanted the coup to happen, but supposedly didn't want him to die. He was killed. So Kennedy cancels his trip because of geopolitics, and they take these guys into custody. We're never told who the 4 people are that line the route. The cops had 2 of those at least in custody. They let them go, never told us who they are. Thomas Arthur Valley was taken into custody. We're lucky we have a mug shot of him and we have the story. We know he was. So now it's off the table in Miami because of this informant who blabbed. Now it's off the table in Chicago because of Thomas Arthur Valley was taken into custody, who was supposed to be the patsy. And the shooters, 2 of the 4, were taken into custody. And the rifles, high-powered rifles, were found in an apartment with the motorcade route on walls. This is all happening before Dealey Plaza. Now it has to happen in Dallas, Marcello's kingdom. And that's where they finally said, okay, we had 3 shots at him. It's got to happen now at the 3rd place. And at the 3rd place, it does happen. And after Oswald is taken into custody, Jack Ruby, J. Edgar Hoover knew. He said right away, this is a mob hit. Obviously, someone silenced them. Privately. He didn't say that publicly. He said privately. He knew it was a mob hit, J. Edgar Hoover, right away. And also Hoover knew that Oswald may not have been, there may have been another shooter. We know that, now you could see Kennedy's head go back and to the left. He got shot from the front, from the grassy knoll. Anybody who watches a Zapruder film and says, oh, that bullet came from behind, has no idea what a bullet does. The shot came from the front. So there was at least one other shooter in Dealey Plaza besides, let's say, Oswald. But Hoover even doubted that Oswald was the shooter. And there's evidence that Hoover said, let's make sure that we prove to the American people that Oswald was the real shooter. He doesn't say the lone shooter. He says the real shooter, Hoover said. And then Hoover also said that he had evidence that whoever was impersonating, there's been a theory, conspiracy theorists they're called, that Oswald, someone impersonating Oswald, was leaving a trail behind leading up to the assassination of Oswald in Mexico City, looking for a Cuban visa, and in back and forth between Dallas and New Orleans. Hoover contacts the Secret Service and the CIA and says, my agents looked at those tapes and listened to them. And they said, that's not Oswald. So someone's impersonating Oswald.
So, and I think what you're saying, Louis, is not really that radical. One of the things that I don't quite understand is RFK immediately afterwards, I think he calls the head of the CIA and asks whether it was a mob hit. And I think he was convinced it wasn't. It seems in some respects, especially from Bobby Kennedy's point of view, he was the guy who had created this enormous ill will between the administration and the mafia. Why do you think Bobby Kennedy himself wasn't convinced? Or maybe he was convinced and never admitted it.
Bobby, he called the head of the CIA, John McCone, and asked him if the CIA did it. And John McCone.
And it was very much of a Catholic to Catholic kind of conversation, wasn't it?
Correct. They were both staunch Catholics. However, McCone wasn't fully apprised of everything happening in his own agency. And underlings later testified that we didn't tell McCone really a lot. We thought it was advisable not to keep McCone in the dark. So McCone was asked by Bobby, hey, did you guys do this? McCone raced over to Hickory Hill, where Bobby was his estate in Washington. He says, no, in Virginia, McLean, Virginia. He says, no, we didn't do this. But Bobby, to the day he died, thought that the CIA, Carlos Marcello, and the Cuban exiles had something to do with it. And that was Bobby's own. Now, at one point or another, head of the Get Hoffa squad was a man by the name of Walter Sheridan. Bobby was dear friends with Walter Sheridan, and he's the one who went after Hoffa for Bobby. And Walter Sheridan was a dogged investigator, and Bobby trusted him with his life. Bobby brought him into the Justice Department, a personal invitation, and made it Walter Sheridan everything he was. And at some point or another, Bobby said to Walter Sheridan, go down to Louisiana, look into this Marcello guy, and do your own quiet investigation. Let me know what you find. I need to know if he did it or he didn't. Walter Sheridan gets back to him and says, the evidence is overwhelming that Marcello had something to do with it, probably orchestrated it. And he said, and he began to get into the details, and Bobby stopped him. And Bobby did not want to hear anymore. And Walter Sheridan's take on that was that Bobby could not live with the regret and remorse that something he had done had ended in his brother's death.
Yeah, and he always said that he was the one who he was the one he thought would be assassinated rather than his brother. I wonder, I mean, if it's true, why wouldn't someone like Marcello, who you see as being central, I mean, he died in 1993. Why wouldn't they eventually come out and boast about it in some form?
Andrew, they are hiding the documents. It's been 60 years, over 60 years, and they're still hiding the documents. Marcello did boast about it. So he was in prison, but the government, whatever the government knows, we don't know yet. They still have to release the final documents. But Marcello was in prison and boasted. He was starting to lose his mind a little. He was suffering from senility towards the end of his life. He's in his 80s. He's in jail, and he's talking to people a little more loosely. And he's cursing the Kennedys. And at one point or another, there was an informant who said, I'm going to start taping this guy if you want me to. And the FBI now had changed. Hoover's dead. Everything in America had changed. They don't mind. Take down the mob. Go after them. Let's get it all out. Who cares? At that point or another, Marcello's in prison. At some point, rather, Marcello's in prison and says to another inmate, yeah, I killed that son of a bitch, and I'm proud and happy I did. My only regret is that I couldn't pull the trigger myself. And the guy goes and they make an FBI report. And they said, oh, shit, let's bury this too. We can't let this out.
What about the RFK assassination on June 6, 1968 in L.A.? Most people don't seem to believe that the mafia, organized crime, had anything to do with that. What's your take on that one?
I don't have evidence at the moment, and I have not done the deepest dive into Robert F. Kennedy's death. It's mentioned in the book. I've read a few books about it. As I understand it, I do not see the mob as being crucial to the murder of RFK. However, there is overwhelming evidence that the bullets came from a different direction than what we are told. And
so what changed? And maybe that'll be another book, Louis, on that. What changed from the point of view of organized crime between 1963, when JFK was assassinated, and the assassination of RFK in the late 60s, in 1968?
Things got better for a while. So as soon as JFK was dead, Bobby was relieved as Attorney General, left the office. Lyndon Johnson didn't like him, despised him. They had, as you had mentioned earlier in the interview, Johnson and Kennedy and Robert Kennedy hated each other. And I outline in the book the reasons why. But at some point or another, when Robert F. Kennedy's gone as Attorney General, and exactly what Marcello said would happen, once you cut the head off the dog, the tail will die. That's exactly what happened. The mob was thrilled because the FBI backed off again. They went back to the Hooverian days where they just ignored the mafia, chase a few communists. We'd rather chase people who protest the Vietnam War than the mafia. They're really not our.
And of course, the rise of civil rights and Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. There's so many things happened in the mid '60s.
Correct. That's correct. And believe it or not, I mean, the mob liked Martin Luther King. I could remember in my days on the street, John F. Kennedy, John Gotti was totally pro everything you could do for the African Americans, do for them in the neighborhood, because he always felt like they got a raw deal. He felt his own way of thinking was Italians get a raw deal in America. We've never been really treated fairly in his mind, he felt. And he felt like even worse was the African American journey through their history in America. So he was pro-African American, and he also knew that if we get juries, there's always going to be African Americans on our juries, and the better we get along with them, the better it is. And I don't think any mobsters had a problem with Martin Luther King or civil rights. Now, I will say this, and this is a little teaser for another something I may write in the future. I was privy to a mob boss who told me something, and I write about this in my memoir 20 years ago. 20 years ago, he said there was a rat, a snitch, an informant in the Colombo family who used to go down south on missions for the FBI, specifically for J. Edgar Hoover. And he believed that guy was responsible for killing King. That something to do with the FBI.
Wow, and Louis, that's definitely a subject for a book. I mean, judging from this conversation, you'd think that your whole book is on the '60s, but it isn't. It's between 1960 and the mid '80s. Mm-hmm. So let's try and get beyond the Kennedys. It's hard sometimes, and America's still struggling to get beyond the Kennedys. They keep on coming back. Now we have RFK Jr. Mm-hmm. In broad terms, what was the difference between the state of Bogota organized crime in 1985 from 1960? Was it business models? Was it power? Was it violence? Was it the families?
Mm-hmm. It becomes much more violent. By Autumn of Empire, by the third volume, they're fighting over the carcass of empire, and they're very violent about it. This is the height of the mob in Bogota Clash of Titans. It's the height. They're at their absolute highest. It's like America after World War II. We had half the world's wealth. We're the number one country in the world. We got a little bit of a thing with the Soviets in the Cold War, but eventually then the wall falls and America comes out as the only superpower. That's where the mob is in Bogota Clash of Titans. They fight against the Kennedys and they triumphed, whether it was with the government's help, members of rogue agents of the CIA, rogue agents of the FBI. It's all in the book. Read it. I urge you to read it.
That's a fascinating way of putting it. So you're suggesting that the mob fought a war against the Kennedys and won because of the assassinations, or certainly the Dallas assassination.
I make a very strong argument for that in the book. I do indeed feel that way. And then there were also internal clashes within the mob. You had, for the first time since the commission was formed in the 1930s, there are now people who are 30 years later, who were born later, who say, why do these old guys from the 1930s still run this thing? We want to overthrow the overthrowing the monarchies, right? The ancient regimes, right? That's what
the Nancy Pelosi's and Joe Biden's.
At some point or another, got to get rid of them. They're too old. You have You have people in America, like you just said, who are like relics. And, there are people who don't want to hear about it or see it anymore. Young
Right. I mean, a
people.
lot of them are in the book. There's Joe Valachi. There's Joe Profaci. I don't know why they're all called Joe. Is that do you have to get into the mafia, Louis? I mean, you're not. Maybe that's why you're no longer in it. Do you have to be called Joe? Joe Bonanno?
My middle name is Anthony, so you need either a Joe or an Anthony.
Yeah, and then there's speaking of Anthony Provenzano. So it was for this 25-year period, it still remained tightly Italian, a tightly Italian American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yep, definitely. And so I go into like you were saying, you have people that are way too old, and the younger people feel like they got to get rid of them, and that happened in the mob. The Gallows felt like Joe Profaci, who was eventually named the Colombo family. They felt this guy's got to go, and there were other mafia.
And they were the Gallo brothers. Joe Gallo is the best known, right?
Crazy Joe Gallo, yeah, and he was like talk about a character. I mean, he was like right out of like central casting.
He could have been in The Godfather. Maybe he was.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, he's a great character to write about. I had fun writing about him because he's great. He's a larger-than-life character. He never reaches the height of seniority in the mob. He's killed before that all happened.
Well, Louis, what about the sort of ideological narrative, if you like, especially at the beginning of the first Godfather movie, that Corleone was the equivalent of the police, that it was all about loyalty and fealty, but you could trust him more than you could trust the local policeman or the local politician. In this period, did the mafia look after its communities?
It definitely did. So there's a man who was a prosecutor. He prosecuted a lot of people in my time. He became a federal judge. I'm not going to mention his name, but he wrote a book, and he said the area that he lived in Brooklyn was absolutely crime-free. He said, I went after the mob, but I have to admit this. He said, I never worried about my wife coming back and forth to work. I never worried about myself. He goes, all around us, you could have crime, but not in my neighborhood. He goes, because the mob made sure of that. Also, too, I was very friendly with Vincent Chingiganti, was a mob boss. I was very close with his family. When Vincent Chingiganti lived in the West Village in Manhattan, there was no crime on that street. No crime anywhere near his neighborhood. People knew, you commit a crime in this neighborhood, you're going in a trunk. You don't commit crimes here. And because of that, after he died, that's when crime ticked up right away.
So this is from, and this will be for the third volume, which
that's the third volume. I'm talking about. This is up until the 80s and 90s.
Right, but this will be the shift into more violence in this third period.
When I grew up in my neighborhood, if you know how many times.
What neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up in Queens. I ended up staying. I was born in Flushing, but I ended up staying in Ozone Park, Queens, Howard Beach, Queens, where the Gottis were. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family. If you robbed a car, or you robbed a house, or you raped a woman, you did not have the cops to worry about. You had us to worry about first. So that's something that doesn't exist anymore. That's something that also, too, there was a very close, when I was young, if the cops were after you, you could go in your neighbor's house and stay on the lam for 3 months. Your neighbor would hide you. Nowadays, you go to my neighbor and say, I'm wanted by the cops. I need to hide in your house. They slam the door in my face around here. They go,
Louis, I can't resist asking this, and I'm sure you'll cover it in the third volume. By the mid-'80s, Donald Trump was already a well-known figure. His family was quite powerful. They were from Queens as well. Did you write at all about the Trumps and organized crime? There's lots of rumors of the association between Fred Trump and organized crime.
No, I left it out because I didn't want to get political. But I will say this about Donald Trump's empire and Donald Trump himself. I do not believe that Donald Trump ever had to deal with a mobster, ever had to whisper behind a construction pile, exchange envelopes. However, that said, any skyscraper that goes up in New York, any construction project that happens in New York, I don't care if it's the Helmsley Building, the West Side Highway. He died now, so I could talk about it. Thomas Petrizzo was a capo in the Colombo family. He was a friend of mine. He supplied the rebar for the World Trade Center. I mean, this is the mob. They controlled the construction in New York. If you wanted to raise a building in New York at some level, somebody had to deal with them. You have to get the cement trucks there on time. You have to get the rebar from somebody. You have to get the unions to do the wiring, to do the pipe fitters, to do the plumbing. You got to get all these guys in there. And if you don't have somebody orchestrating all that with the mob, you're not going to ever get anywhere in New York. Now, that's not exclusive to anything Donald Trump did. That's every single developer in New York. So, would a developer, though, as high as Trump, meet with somebody like Fat Tony Salerno? No, there's no reason to. There are general contractors down here on the bottom who figure that out. The guys at the top don't want to know about it. They don't want to know how these envelopes are being exchanged. They don't want to know how much the rebar is and what it could have been if the mob didn't bring it, or they're bottom line type of guys. So anybody who says like Donald Trump was in the mob, and I don't know, Fred Trump, maybe. I have no idea what Fred Trump did.
That's interesting, and I'm sure you'll cover it more in the third volume. But of course, today we're talking about the second volume, which is just out. Finally, we began by talking about Jimmy Hoffa, who was, I guess, a mirror image in some ways of Bobby Kennedy, who defined this period for better or worse. You also address the death and disappearance of Hoffa. Tell us your theory as a final, some final insights into this remarkable period in the history of the American Mafia.
I'll tell you really quick the reason why he died, and then I'll tell you what I believe happened to him.
And what happened? I mean, did he just disappear one day?
Off the face of the earth. No.
What year was that?
They killed him. Was it 75? They killed him. They killed Hoffa.
Who's they?
Well, the mob. Yeah, the mob. So basically, when Hoffa went to prison, and Hoffa went to prison years later, long after Bobby was gone, because of indictments that Bobby had instigated. So Hoffa goes to prison. He goes to Lewisburg, my old alumni. I was in Lewisburg Penitentiary myself. Hoffa goes to Lewisburg. And when Hoffa's in Lewisburg, he starts to feel like, what? I'm done with the mob. I put this guy, Frank Fitzsimmons, in, and Fitzsimmons, nicknamed Fitz, he'll hold down the fort for me till I get out. Then I'll take the Teamsters back. At some point, the mob gets cozy with Fitz. And they say, you know what? Hoffa used to tell us no once in a while. We got millions and millions out of Hoffa. We built all the hotel casinos in Las Vegas. We built all kinds of development projects across the country. But if Hoffa didn't like the deal, he told us no. Hoffa happened to invest in deals that made money for the Teamsters. Was it illegal? Probably, yeah. It was still illegal because he was giving jobs out to mob guys, but they were good investments. Who's going to argue that investing in Hollywood, in hotel and casinos in Las Vegas is a bad investment? I wish I had an investment like that. So he makes money for the mob, and he makes money for himself and his Teamsters. But at some point or another, Fitz is in there, and the mob gets cozy with Fitz, and Fitz gives them whatever they want. He's a jellyfish. They ask for something. We need 10 million for this project. Sure. Here's 20. Whatever you want. Just leave me alone. Okay, fine. Hoffa comes out, and Hoffa wants to be president of the Teamsters again. He's got a clause.
What year did he come out?
He ended up doing, I think, 4 years.
So
yeah, I might have my years off. Ever since I had COVID, my numbers are slightly off. So don't count me. I got the memory COVID thing. But it's all in the book. Read it. It's all in the book. He did a few years. He came out, and he says, I want it back. I want my Teamsters back. And they say, well, wait a second. Hold on. We like Fitz. No, Fitz was my stand-in. He's out. I'm in. I'll get that clause in my commutation. He was pardoned by Nixon because of mob money, by the way. They gave Nixon $1 million under the table to pardon him. Who's they? Probably Carlos Marcello. They wanted Hoffa out.
Marcello again. He seems like everywhere, this guy.
Marcello pops up a lot throughout the book. That's why he's on the cover of volume 2. So they get Hoffa out. They get him pardoned. They gave Nixon $1 million under the table. Chuck Colson handled the bribe and the commutation. And at some point or another now, Hoffa goes, I'm going to strike that clause and get back into the Teamsters. The mob tells him, no, you're not. You ain't going near here. We like Fitz. He's staying. You're out. Hoffa keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And at some point, he says to them, listen, I know everything. I'll tell everything. I want my Teamsters back. And he starts to accuse Fitz of doing things with the mob that Hoffa had been doing for decades. And the mob goes, what are you, out of your mind? Take a walk. We'll give you any company you want. We'll give you $10 million if you want. Just get the hell out of here. And Hoffa says, no, no, no. It's my Teamsters. I want it back. With the same overzealous attitude Bobby had towards mobsters, now Hoffa has. And that goes back to what you said. Their characters were identical. And Hoffa's doing exactly what Bobby did. Hoffa's now doing. He's repeating it exactly to the T. He won't back down. He tells the mob, I don't care what you do to me. I don't care what happens. I'm not backing down. At some point, Tony Jack from Detroit gets together with Tony Pro from New York / New Jersey. And he says, look,
this is Tony Provenzano.
Anthony Provenzano, who was head of a Teamster outfit in Jersey, but really answered to the Genovese family in New York.
Known, as you say, as Tony Pro.
Tony Pro. So they says, look, we got to get rid of him. He's threatening to rat on us. He's not going away. He's got to go. They make a meeting with him. Tony Jack and Tony Pro are supposed to meet him at the Red Macus Inn, a restaurant just outside of Detroit, 20 minutes outside. Hoffa goes there to meet. A couple of guys pull up in a car. They drive away. Hoffa's never seen again. Here's what happened. And I'm going to tell you, I'd bet my life on it. First of all the theories I could have told the FBI.
You better not be wrong, Louis. Otherwise, you'll end up in the back of a car yourself.
Never happened. I tell you, there's one thing I know. It's this. This is what I know. The mob doesn't kill a guy and drives 1,200 miles with him. He's not in Giant Stadium. He's not under the Verrazano Bridge. Nobody's going to kill a guy in Michigan and go on U.S. highway, whatever, and drive for 1,200 miles to go bury him somewhere else when there's a million places to get rid of him in Michigan. Well, all of the evidence points to two Detroit mobsters who owned a sanitation yard with an incinerator. And right after that was done and Hoffa was incinerated, somebody incinerated the incinerator, which is more evidence that, and I also build a case leading up to it where all of the people involved, I talk about, once again, I urge your listeners to read the book. It's all laid out. If there's one thing I know, it's how the mob gets rid of somebody. And they got rid of Hoffa. And they would never, you'll never find his remains either, because a guy as big a name as Hoffa, they weren't going to let you find his remains. They knew.
Don't give everything away, Louis. We want everyone, as you say, to read the book. It's out today. Borgata, Clash of the Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2 of the trilogy. We still have one more after 1985. I hope it'll be out by this time next year, by the January of 2006. Louis, fascinating stuff. I mean, really important. Bobby Kennedy, Jimmy Hoffa, the assassination of JFK. You're breaking all sorts of news. Great to see you again. Happy and most importantly, a healthy, safe 2025. And we will talk again when the third volume is out. When's it out?
It should be by the end of the year. Thank you. I appreciate great to be on your show again, Andrew. Happy, healthy new year to you and your listeners.